From Mearsheimer's perspective, the phone call between Vladimir Putin and Nicolás Maduro should not be misinterpreted as an emotional gesture of solidarity or ideological alignment. It was neither a nostalgic reminiscence of Cold War politics nor a romantic act of defiance against the United States. Instead, it was a cold, rational move stemming from offensive realism, where great powers relentlessly seek to maximize their relative power and weaken their rivals, especially when the cost is low and the risks are manageable. Today, Russia operates within a strategic environment shaped by constraints. It faces NATO's westward expansion, economic sanctions limiting access to global markets, and a United States determined to maintain its dominance. Under such conditions, Moscow cannot directly challenge Washington by conventional military means. But great powers don't simply accept decline or containment. They seek indirect arenas, spaces where they can complicate their adversaries' strategies without triggering catastrophic escalation. Venezuela fits perfectly into this logic. Geographically, it lies within a region historically considered part of the United States sphere of influence. Politically, it is isolated, sanctioned, and hostile to Washington. Economically, Venezuela possesses vast energy resources that remain strategically important. For Russia, supporting Venezuela doesn't require military deployment, formal alliance commitments, or immediate military risk. A phone call, diplomatic support, and selective economic cooperation are enough to send a signal. American dominance in the Western Hemisphere is no longer indisputable. Therefore, Putin's declaration of full support isn't meant to save Venezuela. Russia has neither the ability nor the incentive to rebuild Venezuela's economy or ensure Maduro's long-term survival. The key is symbolism and leverage. By publicly allying with Caracas at a time when Washington is tightening sanctions, Moscow is demonstrating that U.S. coercive power has its limits. Even under intense pressure, sanctioned nations can find external patrons willing to disregard U.S. priorities. This is typical behavior of great powers. When a dominant power seeks to impose its will through economic or military pressure, rival powers will naturally try to undermine that dominance in peripheral areas. Russia doesn't need Venezuela to prosper or be stable. What is essential is that Venezuela remains outside of complete U.S. control. More importantly, this strategy is asymmetrical. The United States has to expend diplomatic energy, enforce sanctions, manage regional allies, and suffer reputational losses. Russia, in contrast, pays very little. If the situation in Venezuela worsens further, the burden will fall on Washington, not Moscow. If U.S.-Latin American relations become strained, Russia will indirectly benefit. Even failure would be detrimental to the United States. In offensive realism, intent is always secondary to capability and motivation. Putin's call is not a promise of protection. It is a calculated provocation designed to raise the strategic cost of U.S. pressure elsewhere, including Ukraine and Eastern Europe. It reminds Washington that showing off power will provoke resistance, even in areas it once considered safe. The deeper lesson is simple and alarming. As the international system becomes more competitive and multipolar, great powers will increasingly exploit peripheral states as points of pressure. Venezuela is not the cause of this confrontation. It is simply the battleground where larger powers clash. From an offensive realist perspective, the U.S. response to Putin's public support for Venezuela would be forceful, calculated, and deliberately restrained. Washington's goal is not emotional retaliation, nor regime change driven by moral outrage. A far more precise objective is to maintain regional dominance while avoiding unnecessary military losses. Venezuela, despite its rhetoric and symbolism, poses no existential threat to the United States. It lacks the military capacity to challenge U.S. forces, the economic leverage to pressure Washington, and the alliances necessary to sustain a direct confrontation. Great powers only resort to war in situations involving survival or decisive shifts in the balance of power. Venezuela falls into neither of those categories. Therefore, military intervention, however hotly debated in political discourse, is strategically illogical. Instead, the United States will rely on the tools it uses most effectively: economic warfare, diplomatic isolation, and demonstrating dominance through containment. Sanctions are not a sign of weakness, they are tools of control. By tightening restrictions on Venezuela's energy sector, financial institutions, and foreign partners, Washington aims to ensure that Caracas remains economically paralyzed and politically restrained. The message is simple: disobedience will come at a long-term cost, even if it avoids immediate sanctions. At the same time, U.S. policy is not solely aimed at Venezuela. Russia is the real target. Any U.S. response must prevent Moscow from translating symbolic support into a physical presence. This means secondary sanctions on Russian companies operating in Venezuela, intelligence surveillance of energy cooperation, and discreet diplomatic warnings that deeper intervention would lead to broader consequences. The United States is not trying to completely remove Russia from Venezuela. It is trying to limit the extent of Russian influence to a manageable level. Aggressive realism also explains why Washington will avoid dramatic escalation. Overreaction would lead to a balance. A military attack, a naval blockade, or an overt attempt to overthrow Maduro would likely push Russia and possibly China towards deeper intervention. That outcome would undermine U.S. strategic interests by internationalizing an issue currently under control. Dominant powers prefer predictable, frozen conflicts over unstable ones that are difficult for them to control. Therefore, the U.S. response will appear slow and intractable. Sanctions will be expanded. Diplomatic pressure on Latin American governments will increase. Regional alliances will be reaffirmed, but there will be no decisive move to definitively resolve the Venezuela issue. This is not indecisiveness. This is strategic patience. This reflects a broader shift in U.S. strategy. As U.S. power becomes increasingly spread across multiple fronts, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, East Asia, Washington cannot afford to escalate everywhere. Venezuela becomes a secondary front, managed rather than resolved. Containment replaces confrontation. Endurance replaces victory. The result is a familiar pattern in great power politics: persistent pressure without conclusion. Venezuela remains isolated but intact. Russia gains symbolic influence but not a decisive foothold. The United States maintains regional dominance but at the cost of constant enforcement. No one wins outright, but neither does anyone retreat. This precarious balance is not a policy failure, but an inevitable outcome of power politics within a competitive international system. From an offensive realist perspective, the most important question isn't whether tensions between the United States and Venezuela will escalate. The answer is yes, but whether those tensions will cross the threshold to open war. The answer, despite the inflammatory rhetoric and sensational headlines, is almost certainly no. War is unlikely, but confrontation is ever present. The reason is structural, not psychological. Venezuela simply lacks the capabilities necessary to justify a U.S. war. It has no capacity for significant force projection, no network of alliances capable of collective defense, and no strategic assets whose loss would alter the global balance of power. Within Mearsheimer's framework, great powers do not wage costly wars against weaker nations unless their core interests are threatened. In this case, that is not the case. At the same time, restraint should not be confused with reconciliation. The United States cannot tolerate Venezuela becoming a platform for a long-term strategic presence of Russia or China in the Western Hemisphere. That would challenge the long-standing regional order and facilitate future encroachment. Therefore, Washington's policy will aim to prevent escalation without resolving the conflict. This is the logic of a policy of restraint applied to a peripheral state. Russia also understands this well. Moscow will not deploy troops, establish permanent bases, or extend official security guarantees to Caracas. Doing so would cross the U.S. red line and risk retaliation that Russia cannot afford. Instead, the Kremlin will continue to operate below the threshold of escalation through diplomatic support, selective economic cooperation, and symbolic gestures that displease Washington without provoking a confrontation. This is classic probing behavior of great powers. The result is a strategic stalemate. Venezuela is trapped in a position of chronic vulnerability, sanctioned, economically constrained, and politically isolated, yet sufficiently protected to avoid collapse. Russia gains leverage at minimal cost, while the United States bears the burden of long-term enforcement. Neither side achieves a decisive victory, but both prevent the other from completely dominating the outcome. In this sense, Venezuela is not the cause of instability, but rather a symptom of a larger shift in the international system. As the unipolar power of the United States weakens, rival nations increasingly test the limits in areas once considered safe. These tests rarely lead to war between great powers because the risks are too high. Instead, they produce protracted, low-level confrontations that deepen divisions and normalize conflict. For Venezuela, this is a grim equilibrium. The leadership remains, but the people pay the price with economic stagnation and isolation. For the United States, dominance is maintained, but it becomes more costly and less absolute. For Russia, influence is limited, but the symbolic rewards are substantial. Everyone acts rationally in their own interests, but the result is detrimental to the entire community. This is not a failure of diplomacy or imagination. It is the predictable outcome of a system in which there is no higher power to restrain states, no trust to underpin cooperation, and no incentive to prioritize global welfare over national power. Peace, if it exists, is maintained not by shared values, but by the fear of escalation and cost calculations. In that world, Venezuela would not erupt into war. Instead, it will remain what offensive realism predicts: a constant point of pressure in an increasingly competitive international order where confrontation is controlled, suffering is tolerated, and stability is achieved not through harmony but through restraint imposed by power. From an offensive realist perspective, the standoff involving the United States, Russia, and Venezuela is not an isolated episode. It is a warning signal, a glimpse into how international politics behaves as the system moves away from unipolarity and toward sharper great power competition. The significance of Venezuela lies less in its intrinsic value and more in what it reveals about the changing rules of the game. For much of the post-Cold War era, the United States operated with unprecedented freedom of action. It could impose sanctions, intervene militarily, and shape political outcomes with limited pushback. That era is ending. As rival powers grow more assertive, Washington's actions increasingly trigger resistance, not always where expected, but where resistance is cheapest for the challenger. Venezuela is one such arena. Russia's involvement underscores a central Mearshheimerian insight. Great powers exploit peripheral regions to offset disadvantages in core theaters. Unable to roll back NATO expansion or decisively counter U.S. power in Europe, Moscow looks elsewhere to create strategic friction. By contesting influence in America's backyard, Russia sends a broader message. U.S. dominance invites counterpressure everywhere, not just at the main front lines. This pattern will repeat. As competition intensifies, similar dynamics will emerge in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Weak states with strategic locations, natural resources, or symbolic value will become bargaining chips in larger power struggles. Their internal conditions matter less than their utility in great power rivalry. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural reality of an anarchic system. For the United States, the Venezuela case illustrates a growing dilemma. Maintaining dominance now requires constant management rather than decisive victories. Sanctions must be enforced indefinitely. Alliances must be reassured continuously. Peripheral challenges cannot be ignored, but they also cannot be solved without risking escalation elsewhere. Power becomes more expensive, more brittle, and more contested. Importantly, this does not mean imminent American collapse. The United States remains the most powerful state in the system, but relative power, not absolute strength, drives behavior. As rivals gain confidence, they probe more aggressively. Even symbolic challenges matter, because symbolism shapes perceptions of resolve and credibility. If left unanswered, small acts of defiance accumulate into larger doubts about leadership. In this context, Venezuela functions as a test case, but the logic on display there, the probing, the restraint, the perpetual pressure, will define many conflicts to come. In a multipolar world, peace is not secured by goodwill or institutions. It is maintained uneasily through deterrence, caution, and the constant calculation of power.